Certainly, there is a feeling that cities are where the jobs are. Part of it is driven by people's imagination of the city as a place of possible opportunity, but part of it is also driven by their desperation about villages. Every day, 10 villages in India become empty. Any imagination of development, it should originate from the people who are the intended beneficiaries.
Right, right.
The problem with the centrally sponsored schemes is that it is really not a local idea of what would make the city better. Your state led planning process is so slow that it is constantly being outrun by the private sector. And then you say, oh my God, we should have put the infrastructure in those other places.
Right. It's like what comes first, chicken or egg?
No, I'm saying it's worse than that. They are planning for a chicken, meanwhile, a duck is flying. Let's say you live in a city that is not on the smart cities list.
Right.
What does that mean? That your city is full of not smart people? Or that you should not become smart? The really smart approach to urban development has to begin by saying that the cities should be able to make these choices themselves. One thing you can conclude is that every state government thinks that there should be planning bodies, but every state government also appears to think that they need not do any planning.
Very warm welcome to everybody. This is Pavan Kumar. I am an urban researcher and a former data journalist working in urban affairs with India's Pen. So for his Paul Echo podcast today, that we thought we should talk more on the cities aspect covering from taking off from what we did last episode. So today we are joined by a very eminent personality and an urbanist himself, Mr. Ashwin Mahesh from Bengaluru. Namaskaram. And Indian cities have a very distinct framework, or rather, the way they operate is very different from what we see outside India, even in neighboring countries. So, in that regard, if you look at it from the people's perspective, on the ground level, how do you think Indians view cities as? Because Gandhi once said, uh, the most of India's success progress lies only in the villages, and not he was not a city fan or someone who supported the growth of cities in that sense. So, in that, how do you think people view it? View the agglomerations and cities as in the modern time, in today's time?
Certainly, there is a feeling that cities are where the jobs are, right? And therefore, people are going to cities and towns of various sizes. Either they go to a large metropolitan city or they go to a mid sized city or a tier 3 city, even in their own state. A lot of migration is still within states, but there's also now migration across states, especially to major metropolitan areas.
Right, right,
And so, and part of it is driven by people's imagination of the city as a place of possible opportunity, but part of it is also driven by their desperation about villages, which is to say that if they can't imagine a livelihood and a future in their village, then quote unquote they have to go out. And when they get to that point, the only other reference they really have, maybe one or a few other villages that are nearby, but the obvious next reference is some town somewhere, right? That if you're living in a village, you know a few villages around yourself, and then you know towns and cities. So in a sense, it's natural for people to look to places that they've heard of, people where others that they know have gone. So there is a acceleration of familiar patterns and choices that others in cities have made. Every day, if I remember right, okay, let me do the math on this. Yeah, every day 10 villages in India become empty. So that's really the pace at which people are leaving the villages. Already 40,000 villages are empty, and in the next decade, another 40,000 villages will become empty. And this is the reality. But you can't also grudge this. People are doing what is necessary for their families and for themselves. And at some level, we have to accept that if we have concentrated opportunities only in cities, then we should expect that people will concentrate in the cities as well. If we think there is some reason to have a wider distribution of opportunities, and if we create that, perhaps people will be more widely distributed as well. But it's a debatable question. 30 odd million people live in Tokyo, Yokohama. It is the largest urban cluster in the world, but it's a very livable place. It's organized well, things work well. A lot of people have nice things to say about living in places like that. By and large, our cities are very populous because people find it attractive to live there. There are always things that we don't like as well, but things like traffic, things like maybe housing crises, and things like the air quality, things like that. But people weigh all this against the alternative. I say, okay, fine. If I give up all of this stuff and remain in a village or in a smaller town, what are some of the other things I won't have? What kind of job will I have? What kind of savings will I have? What kind of quality of life will I have? What is the social infrastructure of that region? I think people also don't have the luxury of thinking too much beyond their own immediate surroundings. Right? It's even if you take a city like Bangalore, you can say, I think now we have reached the stage where most people think they live in one part of the city. They know they live in Bengaluru, but if they will also say, I live in South Bangalore, I live in whatever,
A more localized approach.
yeah, there is a sense, of course, that this is all one city. But you go fast forward 20 years, and let's say there are three airports and two more railway stations and all of those in different parts of the region, then it becomes a regional thing, right? Or even if the government were to say, okay, Bangalore has become very large, we now have to split it into 5 or 6 cities, and let's say the one in the center is called Bangalore, and then you happen to live in an outlying ward which is now called something else. It's called Yashwantpur, it's called Mahadevpura, whatever kind of thing. Then you begin to associate with that name and that brand as well. So, in a sense, and that reinforces your sense that you only live in that part of the region, that you're not really.
Right, right, right. And given a certain experience of how Bangalore has worked, because I've been to Bangalore quite a lot of times and have lived in Hyderabad and switched across cities, I think to an extent we also feel that cities which were left out. For instance, when the idea of smart cities came in, when the idea of smart cities was brought in, I believe not many were ready to actually by that idea that we can only focus on certain aspects of cities or features of cities rather than entire city as such. So in that context, I also have this doubt whether so the smart city ideas that came in had a lot of promises with it in terms of improving its transit, improving its mobility, improving its electrification projects, and a lot of other things. So, from that point of view, how do you see this concept of smart cities playing out? Because from my report to India, with India spent a few months ago, it was found that the progress is still meager, and there's a lot of areas in which they have to focus on, or even redo or rework the whole project in a certain way. So, how do you see the smart cities aspect panning out? Given that Bangalore is a smart city, but Hosur, which is next to Bangalore, also has a potential to be a smart city or developed as a smart city, but it has not been so. So how do you see that?
Well, any imagination of development should, at least partly and ideally substantially, It should originate from the people who are the intended beneficiaries.
right, right,
I cannot come to you and say, Pavan, I have an idea of how you should live, and that would be really good for you. In a sense, it's better if I ask you, what is your idea of how you should live? That would make your life better.
right, right.
So, the problem with the centrally sponsored schemes is that it is really not a local idea of what would make the city better. I'm not saying it's automatically wrong for that reason, but it's not the local idea of what will make the city better. Number one. Number two, let's say you live in whatever a city that is not on the smart cities list.
Right.
What does that mean? That your city is full of not smart people, or that you should not become smart while others become
Very valid
smart,
question. A very valid question.
or you should wait for your turn to become smart while others become smart before you. Now you can say that there are funding constraints, there are budgetary constraints, and therefore, you have to make a beginning and so on and so forth. Actually, that may be true, but it's also not necessary to do it that way. You can say, for example, that a small portion of taxes, just like today, a portion of the taxes goes to the states and to the center. You can say a small portion of the taxes will go to the local bodies also.
Right, right,
And if you do that, every local body will get money. And they can then choose to spend it in ways that are particular to itself. Mysore may choose to spend it in one way, Davangere in a different way, Hyderabad in a different way, and so on and so forth. So, in a sense, the really smart approach to urban development has to begin by saying that the cities should be able to make these choices themselves.
absolutely.
If that is, and to be able to fund them,
Right,
right, from their own revenues. So, in a sense, if we don't check these two boxes, decisions made in local councils and by local citizens, number one, and funded by their own collections of revenues, right? Without these two starting points, you will always get a very small set of cities and towns that receive attention and funding
right,
from the state government or the national government,
right, right,
and a very much larger set that don't get anything like that, right? As long as the programs are run by the center or the state, you will never touch every town. As long as those, but if the programs are run by the towns themselves with their own funds and with a certain mechanism for every town to get funded,
right,
then they will all do smart things.
right,
The definition of smart may be different. Some may do some things, some may do other things. I remember many years ago, not to do with cities, there was an MLA in the city who told me, the government has given some 2 crores to every MLA constituency in the city to improve the maternity hospital in their constituency.
right.
So I said, that's very good, isn't it? And he said, not really. We don't have a maternity hospital. So if you don't have a maternity hospital, being allocated 2 crores to improve it doesn't really do anything for you. So now you have to say, well, hello, we don't have a maternity hospital. Can you give us 2 crores for something else? And then somebody in either the finance department or the health department will say, no, no, this money is only available for this purpose, but not for any other purpose. So, in a sense, I feel we must localize public expenditure more and more and decentralize public expenditure more and more with more flexibility in how money gets used. Schemes that dedicate money for very specific uses are they reduce the flexibility of local government, local councils to work with them. And therefore, I would say real smartness will come from an approach that is immediately applicable in every town and city, and an approach that depends on their own strengths.
Right, right. And there's a lot of talk when we see, when we juxtapose this idea of smartness with the idea of planning. And economics tells us that the smart city idea or the whole concept of developing a smartness is only an ad hoc represent addition. It's not an addition to cities rather than transforming cities in a major way. So if there is for instance, in T Nagar in Chennai, the smart cities project focused on developing that particular stretch into a more wide and more walkable stretch and making it easier for people to go around. Likewise, in under Tendershare project in Bangalore, where this kind of a thing is being implemented. But beyond that, when we look at the larger problems of the cities are left out. So from that logic, when we look at concept of planning, and cities being planned or unplanned. Sometimes unplanned also has their own advantages. For instance, in cities like Surat, which developed on its own organically, there's a certain sort of development happening, and sort of people are ready to put in funds. Even the private players are ready to come in. So, what is what is the Indian idea of planning? Should we copy what Chandigarh did and replicate it in terms of planning, or is there any other way out? What could be a one? Obviously, there cannot be a one size fits all. So, what is the Indian idea of planning so far? Has there been any concrete development on what could be one?
The if you look at what is going on in governments across the country, the one thing you can conclude is that every state government thinks that there should be planning bodies, but every state government also appears to think that they need not do any planning, right? So essentially, you have set up the institution, but it doesn't do what you say you set it up for.
Yeah,
So, in a sense, what we end up with is what Yes Minister called activity without achievement. Right? We go through the motions of various things. On paper, we have everything. In practice, we don't have any of those things working.
right,
Some years ago, I was called to be a co-chief guest at an annual function of the Department of Town and Country Planning, and it was their 50th anniversary or something like that. In 50 years, they had not created even one town planning scheme anywhere in Karnataka.
my God. Okay,
Right? In a sense, they create a lot of master plans, but the master plans are supposed to be followed up by town planning schemes,
right, right,
and that activity is not done anywhere.
right,
So I said, as part of what I said of my speech that day, I said, why I want to encourage you to do one town planning scheme anywhere in Karnataka, right? For the next year. And at that time, I was in government as well. And I said, I'll even help you if you identify something like that you want to do. But like I said, that really is the problem. There is no translation of the color schema. Like it's almost like you color coded the city, but there's no translation of that color schema to actual outcomes on the ground. And also, this the other part is that the planning rules apply to you and me as citizens, but the government itself doesn't appear to follow the planning rules while expecting you and I to follow.
right.
So we've today, I think, in a lot of these cases, the correct way to look at them today is to say we must stop asking these technical questions. What we have today is a social and a political problem.
Right.
We have a political economy that has captured the real economy, and because of that, and there are sort of political games to create social divides as a distraction from this other part. So essentially, that in some sense, there is a lot of collusion in plundering the city, but there's also a lot of collusion in creating other political events as distractions while that plunder is going on. Oh, now let's talk about some riot in this part of town, or some whatever, some social tension of some kind or the other. So in a sense, both proponents and defendants are locked in a cycle of talking about the social tensions because time passes in doing that, instead of people asking, what about this sewer, what about this road, what about this, whatever kind of thing. And I think that's the tragedy of how we have allowed the politics to really fall very low today. It is because almost all the technical thing. What do you think of smart cities? What do you think of Swachh Bharat? These are all technical distractions. Who wouldn't want well-managed cities or clean cities or any of those kinds of things, right? And the distraction works like this. Let's say that Pavan is supposed to have a right to do something. So I come to Pawan and I say, Pawan, how would you like to do something else? Whatever, right? And then you say, but I really have a right to do this first thing. And you say, we'll talk about that. But meanwhile, how would you like to do this other thing? And we spend all our time talking about this other
Right,
thing, when
right.
in fact, what you want to talk about is the first thing. So this is really what I mean by distraction. We spend all our time. Why isn't there a council election? Why isn't there a local corporator? Why isn't there ward level budgeting? Why isn't there citizens' participation in the areas of us? These are all things that are in the constitution and the law. Why isn't there any of those things? And why isn't there a planning commission committee for the city? Instead of talking about these things, now we end up talking about what do you think of smart cities, what do you think of Swachh Bharat, and all of those things. Those are all projects, right? Essentially, what you were referring to earlier also is to say that our imagination of the city has been reduced to projects.
Exactly.
It's not an imagination of the city at all. It is just an imagination of that project. That's all.
And if I may add to that, a lot of questions that we see in Parliament on the urban affairs, and to an extent, what you say is actually right from that perspective. That we are talking about cities only from the perspective of X, Y, Z projects, and not cities as a coherent whole in themselves. And when I spoke to a few experts earlier in my earlier avatar as a data journalist, I came across quite a few aspects that we don't utilize our urban land enough, nor are we looking at the cities with a non-political lens. Of course, I mean, cities are hubs of this political and socio-economic activity that way, and a large part of it is driven by that. So a lot of these projects and all these transformation that we see in the city are also driven by political considerations to an extent, and that is a inescapable fact. So, from the fact, given the fact that a lot of it is even having a political aspect to it, do you think, 'cause this is a little bit off the main track that we are going, but I still want to ask that question because so a lot of these projects are announced, or city level or mayoral council elections are being, a lot of it is having a lot of political sense to it. That this party will do this, that party. But at the ground level, when it comes to political ideology perspective, do you think they have any solid plans for how cities should look like, and what drives these political actions? Given your experience in the political sphere as well, to an extent, so how do you see parties thinking about these aspects, and how should they think about it if they were to see that we should transform cities?
There are actually no parties. The party is just a vehicle
Right,
for private interest. Some random guy has got the ticket. He's got the ticket for a certain goal, and that goal is well known to everybody. And in a sense, and then what happens? 10 other people like that get other tickets, and then there's a contest. Some people take sides in this contest because they feel strongly about something or the other, usually some social thing. And other people are just fed up of the whole thing. I've said enough of this thing. I'm not even going to go anywhere near it. About 40% of the people now don't bother to vote at all. So, in a sense, we've reached a point where these games are going on in a way that it's like, if you say, even when a party does something, right? Let's say that you say some party comes and says, I'm going to provide something as a benefit in a state. If usually you'll find that if that party is in power in another state, they may not be doing the same thing there. And what that tells you is there are social compulsions that have made you do whatever it is that you have done here, or political compulsions, right? So you can, and that's what I mean by saying that, or you'll get distractions. The national party will say one thing, and the state party will say one thing. For example, there is, free power was promised in Goa, even by the ruling party. But free power was not really part of the agenda of the party, or people in the party were saying, oh, these things should be looked at based on what their budgetary implications are as well. So in a sense, you can get that, which is okay if there are some local variations as well. But what I'm saying is that the party is just a vehicle. It's an instrument through which these personal interests are channeled at the time of the election. And that's also why, after the election, those personal interests, people are quite willing to move to some other party. They happen to be in some party, right? But that is an instrument. And because it is only an instrument, they are quite happy to choose some other instrument later as well. And this has been going on. Incidentally, the anti-defection law was passed in the 1980s.
Right,
But defections are going on very strongly, actually. In fact, defections are at an all-time high, probably. Now the methods are also so brazen, right? So in a sense, the courts have also not really clamped down on all of these things.
right, right, right.
It's very easy to say a person who is elected on a party ticket, if he leaves the party for any reason, will not be eligible to become a member again until the end of the term. If you say this is obvious, 99% of the people would agree to that it is logical at first instance. You are giving up membership of an organization. You cannot immediately claim membership of the same organization if you had that membership yesterday, right?
Right.
So I think, but defections continue. So what I'm trying to say is that the political games are actually personal. They are not party political games, but they are always portrayed to you as party political games.
So, if I may say so, I think it would be safe to say then that social choice, I mean, personal choice or personal interest masquerading as social choice, so to say, when it comes to these kind of aspects. And moving on from that, to take a digression from there and come back to the main issue. So we look at transit, right? So a lot of these projects are obviously announced by political leaders and launched by political leaders because they're representative of the public face and trust in the order and system. So transit in India and particularly in cities, if we look at it from the history of the pre-independent days, of course, in the pre-independent days, the motives would have been a little more different, but they had a certain uh, tangible benefits in terms of planning properly for the city systems, transit systems, for instance, in Bombay or in the trams in Calcutta, Madras, and even in Hyderabad to an extent. A lot of it was driven by trying to help the public to sort of make the mobility question, make the mobility in an easier way, move around. A lot of these developments happen that way. But when it comes to the post-independence period, of course, the growth of cars, and then we have the bus systems to be the most extensively used ones in cities. Apart from, of course, the personal vehicle growth has been there in the last 20, 30 years since the 1990s. So, do you think the cities are looking at transit systems more as a way of expanding the cities or just trying to give the citizens a way of transport or means of transport? Is it like, because the theory in urban economics tells us that transport investments do both. They also expand the city horizons as well as add to the denizens' ease of mobility. Do you think cities are doing it in that direction, or was there any other logic to why cities are sort of trying to invest heavily in metro and not in the bus systems?
Again, I go back to what I said earlier. There is no thinking about the city. There is only thinking about projects.
Right, right,
And projects are driven by some highly localized interest, right? So maybe some political leaders believe that it's advantageous to them to drive this project or that project, uh, and therefore those projects get taken up. But this is not an imagination of the city; it's just an imagination of that project, and therefore it's not even useful to frame the question in the way that you did, that pre-independence it was like this, post-independence it's like this kind of thing.
Right.
It's hard to say. I
Hmm.
think even pre-independence there were lots of bad motives,
Right.
but today certainly there isn't an imagination of the city. There's only an imagination of projects, and many projects have bad motives. That's just true, right? Now, you can say, okay, what are you supposed to do as a citizen in such a scenario?
Very good. The next question. Yeah.
Yeah, and most people give a tautological answer. They will say, oh, the people in charge should do the right things, right? After all, they are elected, they are supposed to do the right things. But they have figured out how to rig the system in a way that they don't have to do the right things, many of them. Now the question is, it's a second order question. If they are not doing the things that you want them to do, or even the right things, what are you supposed to do? And most people don't want to address that question.
A hard reality, I must say. A very hard
That
reality
is
to.
true.
Yeah.
Yeah, most people don't want to address that question of if your elected representative or if your local bureaucracy is not doing what you want them to do, what should you do? Right? One answer is to say vote for somebody else. And then if they don't do what you should do, vote for somebody else. You can continue in that vein. But the correct answer, the practical answer in the constitutional frame of things, is to say create a different kind of political organization. That is what it amounts to. This is why does any new political organization come up? Because there is a sense that there is a space that is not represented by anyone in the current political landscape.
Right. Right.
Therefore, a new organization comes up to occupy that landscape. So I think even India is going through that. All countries go through that. As long as there are multiple parties, you are going to find some party emerge to say, I will occupy a space that does not seem to be occupied by anybody else. Some people will say, I'll occupy a space that represents a particular group because that group is not represented anywhere in any other party. Or somebody will say, yeah. But in the same way, you can say, I'll create a political party for good governance because good governance does not seem to be represented in any political party yet.
Yeah.
So these are, and this is really the only way forward. That if you think that the current administrative and political space is not occupied by anyone that you like, then the only alternative is to stand up or help stand up someone else who will do what it is that you like.
Very good. The next question. Yeah.
And that's just not, and it's not just, that's just not my point of view. That is the constitutional framework that people create their representative bodies to go and advocate on behalf of their interests and even seek votes.
Right. Right. So, moving forward from there, given your expertise in dealing with the urban problems in and around Bangalore, uh, and recently there has been a lot of talk about the way, the mayoral elections are yet to be held, I believe. It's yet, there's a lot of lag in the elections to be held in 2019. I'm not really sure which
About
day.
3 years. About 3 years.
Yeah, and likewise in a lot of other cities, the focus on or whatever you this is linking it to what you said in the first half of this episode, that cities do not have that power, nor do they have that wherewithal to take up projects. And
No, that second part I don't. Second part I don't agree.
right,
If you
okay,
have not given them the power, how can you tell them that they don't have the say that they
yeah,
don't have
yeah,
the
it's a
wherewithal?
it's a follow it's a follow on with that. So when
No, it's not a follow. It's not a
okay,
follow. I'm saying I don't even want to create that connect. Cities, why? Can I when I meet you for the first time, should I assume that you are incapable of some things? No, right? Any logical explanation, any logical understanding of human intelligence and people's initiative is that you have some capacity. My opening line cannot be that you don't have capacity.
Right, right,
In fact, the progressive way of thinking is to think that you have capacity
right, right.
unless it is restrained by somebody. So I believe that cities and towns have significant capacity. Keep in mind, panchayats have a lot more money. Panchayats have a lot more money, and villages have a lot less educated people. Correct. So somehow the rural governance framework trusts local bodies to have the capacity to do things. But
Fair
the
enough.
urban governance framework does not trust local bodies to have that same capacity.
And I think it's an evolving phase where we are slowly understanding the importance of city governance and going forward from there.
No, no. Again, I would say it's not that we are slowly understanding it.
Right.
The law already understood it in the 1990s.
Yeah, under 74th Amendment for viewers. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
So far, state governments have refused to implement the law.
Right, right.
Right? They've refused to implement. Why have they refused to implement the law? Because they don't want to give up control. Why don't they want to give up control? Because it suits their personal interest.
Yeah, yeah. And this is a very long-standing argument that I've heard from many people that even when I was writing my smart city story with people from Janagraha and a lot of other people were telling me that this is one problem that states and that centralization narrative continues to hold sway in the urban rural dynamics and playing with the city's infrastructure. So the
But
question,
I also blame some of the civil society organizations.
I see, I see.
They should not be working with national governments and state governments on local issues.
I get that. And
If you understand, you can't say that I believe in decentralization, I believe in local decision making, and I'm going to work with the government of India to influence them.
the question there was that when it comes to these kind of uh, decent a lot of even in the smart cities context, a lot of this decentralization thing has been one of repeated discussions. When I spoke to people, they were all telling me that the whole idea of smart cities was one thing, but to even implement them, it's a different ball game altogether. But when it comes to a larger question of urbanization itself, the decentralization is something that is sorely missing. And somebody also pointed out that in India, for instance, despite all the talk about urbanization and growing urbanization, the top 10 cities occupy only 0.2% of the entire land mass. So that way, when we look at the relative size of our cities, it's much less, and the usage of rural land and rural townships is much more. And that points to what you say that the capacity development in rural areas to an extent is more focused there than in the cities. So from that perspective, if we were to sort of imagine kind of transit possible within cities and between rural areas and cities. We have had experiments in Bombay, and Bombay local is suburban. It sort of expands and gives a lot of access to people outside Bombay and just outside like Thane and outside. But in other cities, that kind of projects, for instance, have failed to take off, and that has sort of led to political choices of making, I mean, putting focus on systems like the metro, ignoring the buses. So when what do you think could have been the reason? Even in Hyderabad, for instance, I mean Chennai is an exception in that case that they still have an internal suburban rail system, but Hyderabad has sort of not lived up to that promise that suburban rail would sort of connect and expand the city in a way. That has not happened. So why do you think? And even Bangalore, I think there was a long-standing suburban project from the 80s which was not taken up for different reasons. But how do you see that impacting city growth in one sense, in any, from a very common perspective sense? How does that impact the city growth?
See, the thing is, cities have today what I would call directionality in how they sprawl, right? Bombay sprawls in a particular way, Bangalore sprawls in a particular way, Chennai sprawls in
right.
a particular way. Even in Chennai, there isn't any mass transit going from the southeast to the northwest.
Yeah, yeah,
There's a lot that goes from the northeast to the southwest, but there isn't anything that goes from the southeast to the northwest. So, in a sense, and in Bombay also, the east-west lines are not doing as well as the monorail, for example, is a complete failure. It lost some 250 crores last year or some such thing like that. So, in a sense, there are two, three things happening with the cities. One is that during the construction phase of these large projects, there is a lot of money being spent in putting the project itself together. And somewhere in that process, there is not enough attention to how much money these projects are losing. Number one.
right.
If once the construction stops or ends, suddenly you realize there isn't a flow of capital to keep that organization going, and suddenly you need quote unquote subsidies to keep that going. You saw what happened with the airport express line in Delhi. I mean, it was fine, it still runs, but today it's running because the government is giving money to run it.
Yeah,
Right? It has no vitality because it's sort of not really thought through in as a complete urban development initiative. It's sort of thought through as a mobility initiative at the most. And I think similar things can happen with the metro in many of our cities. The cities are not sprawling in the same directions as the mobility systems appear to assume. If you look at so what happens is that Bangalore sprawls in a certain direction, and then after that sprawl is complete, we say, oh, now we need metro in those new directions because it has become so built up.
right, right.
Whereas what should be happening is that the city should sprawl in the directions where you have the mobility infrastructure. That's what you want,
Absolutely.
right? So it's now what's happening now is the opposite of what you want. You have a scenario in which rather than planning directing the sprawl and the planning including the mobility infrastructure, the housing infrastructure and all of that, for which then creates sprawl in a certain direction, then all of it will come together. But what you have now is randomness, right? There's one more thing. If
Right,
you take the case of Bangalore, in the northwest, west, and southwest of the city, right? The government of Karnataka has notified thousands of acres of land for planned development. Shivrama Karant layout, Pigoda layout, Solur, satellite town cities. Lots of this are in that arc between the north and the southwest. Okay. The city, meanwhile, has sprawled extensively in the other direction.
toward the east, right, and south. Yeah,
Yeah, it's east and southeast,
right,
right? The city is sprawled in the exact opposite direction as the government plan, right? And that tells you that somehow the two are related. How is it possible that the government is planning to grow the city to the west and the southwest, but the actual development is to the east and the southeast, or even the northeast? And the reason is that there's one thing in Indian planning and development which is unusual. If Pavan has a house, if Pavan has a plot of land, he has a right to build on it. That's actually not true in many parts of the world. First of all, people don't, except especially in developed countries, people don't own land. People own homes, right? And clusters of homes come up together as a community. An entire neighborhood of 20,000 houses, 30,000 houses, or 100,000 large townships of 20 to 100,000 houses will come up. And a planning authority will say, oh, our proposal is that the next 100,000 homes should come up in the southwest. Right, for whatever reason, maybe they can, for whatever reason, they have water, they have whatever electricity, they have all these things needed, or maybe they think that's the best direction in which to grow the city. But what they will also say is that this means that applications for home construction in any other part of the city will not be entertained.
Right, right, right,
You understand? So the planning authorities decide what is allowed as well as what is not allowed. But the Indian planning scenario is different. If you own a plot of land, you have the right to build on it. So what happens? You get applications for construction from all over the place,
right, right. Makes sense. Right,
and these are randomly approved, right? They're not selectively approved from one part.
right,
They're approved from every part of the city. Then what happens? But now, consider what the city does. The state is going to notify land for acquisition and development in the west and the southwest, northwest, west, and southwest. But that is a very, very, very slow process, right? People contest the notification. Acquisition takes time because there isn't any money. Redevelopment takes time. Allotment takes time. Everything takes time, right? Now, in during that time, which let us say is 15 years or 20 years, there are other applications that have come up in the other parts, other directions.
makes sense. Right.
That's what's happened. That your state-led planning process is so slow that it is constantly being outrun by the private sector. And then you say, oh my God, we should have put the infrastructure in those other places.
Right. It's like what comes first, chicken or egg? And that question is
No,
continuously.
no, I'm saying it's worse than that. They are planning for a chicken, meanwhile, a duck is flying. Right? So essentially, the chicken and this is not chicken and egg, this is chicken and duck. You understand? The- there is neither chicken nor egg, but instead there is a duck.
That's a good way to put it, indeed.
So that's what's happening in these cases. The city, unless the city's planning is rapid and provides leadership, the ad hoc alternatives will direct the outcomes.
And this is one experience I've had. Uh, in a lot of these smaller cities, Vijayawada and or in Pune also, in the initial stages in the last 15 years, to an extent, some of these cities were given the teeth and the muscle power to actually work on town planning. And to an extent, they had come up with these kind of alternatives where, I mean, the state would do it in a certain way and only certain areas would be developed properly and then accordingly forget the transit option. But the city would anyway develop in those areas only. But with the changes that we've seen in the countries in cities outside India, like in Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, New York, and Paris, I'm mentioning these cities in specific because they implemented something known as, I think we are aware of it, which is known as the transit-oriented development. This is exactly what you had alluded to just a little while ago. That transit has to be developed, and accordingly, you develop the commercial and residential areas and even the office spaces accordingly. But I had filed an RTI a couple of months ago and asked the Ministry of Urban Affairs how many cities have actually taken up this project. While there are a few handfuls, I mean, literally a few cities which have come out with a TOD policy. Delhi, Bombay doesn't have, but a certain aspect of Bombay, it's like nobody is clear who's implementing it. Bangalore has a DULT, which is sort of the nodal agency to implement it, but cities otherwise have left it to the metro corporation to take hold of it, take charge of that project, or rather that kind of development idea. But do you see that kind of development idea panning out in cities? So because they're trying to say that we have to have a national oriented plan is also existing for that in terms of guidelines. But do you think that idea at work would sort of solve some of the sprawl problems in Indian cities?
It can, but not in the current way.
Okay, what could be the alternate way then, the way it can be
And it
implemented?
goes back to what I said earlier. Let's say a transit corridor has been identified, and the government says we want to strengthen development in this transit corridor. Right now, Pavan comes along. He happens to have a plot of land that is not in the transit corridor.
right.
He goes to the development authority and he asks for permission to build something within the permissible FSI and all of that stuff, right? Now, should the department say, no, no, our preference is to have the next round of development happen only in the transit corridor. Therefore, we are not going to let you build a house. And the problem with concentrating development in the transit corridor is that you have to stop development from occurring elsewhere. Otherwise, the concentration will not happen. People will continue to go make applications for doing something else that is outside your plan. Now, the problem in the Indian scenario is that everyone buys land thinking that they will be able to do two things. One, the land will appreciate in value, they'll be able to sell it. Or second, they'll be able to buy a house, build a house on it. This is why they have bought the land. Now, if you go and tell them you can't build on it, the price of the land will crash. If the price of the land crashes, whoever enacted that policy will lose the next election.
It's I think one has to agree with the fact that in the Indian dynamics, a lot of it is linked to the ultimately linked to how it's a mix of the freedom of the individual to take up an action on utilize the land that he has versus what city planners want or how people want the cities to.
But there is a way to do it. There's a way to overcome this, which is for the government to say, today what happens that almost no land is provided for rental housing.
Right,
All land is provided only for owned
right,
housing. So what the government should say is that the 30% of the next set of permissions for home construction will be for rental housing only. And all of that rental housing and commercial developments around that will come up in the transit corridor. You can easily push rental housing to the transit corridor.
makes sense.
You can't push owned housing to the transit corridor because owned housing is linked to ownership of land. Rental housing need not be linked to ownership of land. You can even lease land for that. Or you anyway, if you build large enough rental things, the land value is not that important.
Right, right, right.
So what needs to happen is that you have to ask yourself, if you want transit orientation, what are the things that you can easily move to the transit corridor, and what are the things that you can today owned housing cannot be moved to the transit corridor.
Fair enough.
That's the problem. The other problem in the Indian context in particular is that the transit corridors infrastructure is not much better than the rest of the infrastructure. So even if you say outer ring road in Bangalore is going to be like a transit oriented development zone, the place is already like a nightmare. You can say, oh, that means lots of people want to be there. So that's why it's so crowded and chaotic and also that's not a bad thing. But what I'm trying to say is, if I'm trying to buy a house, I mean, if you think about it, is an interesting thing. Why did certain parts of Hyderabad, certain parts of Navi Mumbai, certain parts of Bangalore, why did they become major economic job creation spheres today? In a very large number of cases, the answer is because 20 years ago or 25 years ago, a bunch of people moved to those neighborhoods to build houses for themselves. These were, wealthy, newly wealthy people at that time, and they became the entrepreneurs who created the next set of companies. And they created those companies around themselves.
Right.
In a sense, capital formation for jobs is going to follow the entrepreneurs physically.
Absolutely. That's an
You,
evident change. Right.
if Pavan is a rich guy and he's going to create a company that creates 1,000 jobs, the chances are very high those jobs are going to come up somewhere near Pavan's house.
And I think to an extent, if I look at it, even the cinema industry in Hyderabad, which is
Yeah,
concentrated in a certain pocket, is
yeah,
entirely out of that logic that a certain set of actors moved in there and then they concentrated around their
correct,
places of
correct.
residence.
Many
And
years ago, many years ago,
yeah,
Many years ago, I had gone to Amravati, and
The
this
one in
was,
Andhra, the
yeah,
present Andhra capital.
the one
Right.
in Andhra. This was when CBN was chief minister at that time. Maybe this was so. This was all what pre uh, pre. No, Amravati was still being constructed. Um, Amravati, yeah. I forget exactly how CBN was chief minister of the divided part also for some time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Between
Okay.
2014 and 19. Yeah.
Okay. So it was during that period, I think. And there was one question, and there was a discussion about how to make a city like Amravati successful. And in that discussion, there was an interesting thought experiment that was proposed, which is to say, you get really accomplished and talented people from around the country who you admire, and you get them to live in Amravati for 3 months of the year. You don't do anything else. If you do this,
Yeah, this was
they will drag the social and economic ecosystem around themselves to the place anyway. So the reason I'm pointing to this is I think we still have an imagination of development that is based on structures
yeah, yeah.
and institutional structures. I think we have to have an imagination of development that is based on people.
That is on that note. I think it's this. This is something we have to leave our viewers with, and given the positive time, this is a very to viewers who are watching this. I'll just point out that from the urban economics point of view, what Mr. Mahesh had just alluded to, that we have to imagine cities as people, is something that is the undercurrent of urban economics, and this is alluded to even by Professor Edward Glaser from the Harvard University, who points out in his book called The Triumph of the Cities, which I believe the viewers should check out. He gives an extensive explanation as to why we should imagine cities not as some bodies or some sort of landmass or something, but cities with people in it, with people who develop it, with people who imagine and create things. Silicon Valley is not because is what it is, not because it is of it is having Cisco and other companies, Tesla, Microsoft, or of course that's in Seattle, but the whole valley is filled with tech companies. But it's also because these minds which sort of gave rise to ideas such as Facebook or Google, all of these was concentrated there. And that is how it became a Silicon Valley, or so to say, what it is. And on that note, I believe we should take up this subject again at a later point of time. But for now, that's all for today. And thanks a lot, Mr. Mahesh, for engaging with me and with this channel for the last 1 hour. And it was absolute pleasure hearing from you.
No, thank you very much, Pawan.
And
I hope you found it interesting.
yeah, and I believe to viewers who are watching this, let's not forget that it's not just cities, but even rural areas have a certain focus. So we cannot ignore the rural areas at the expense of cities. We have to focus on both, and both have people, and both determine a lot in how either the villages or cities move forward. On that note, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.